Hello, my name's Martin Snow. I am the Bishop of Leicester in the Church of England. And I've been working with Ali Campbell on the setting up of a new charity called Paraclesis, which we hope will be a support network for children's, youth and families ministers. No doubt Ali will tell you more about that. But Ali invited me along to be a part of your conversations today. Sadly, I can't do that, but I thought I'd send a quick message to say that I'm looking forward to hearing back the results of your conversations and then feeding those into the wider conversations going on in the Church of England at the moment. You will know, I hope, that work with children and young people is a priority within the new vision and strategy that's being led by the Archbishop of York, and it is going to shape the resourcing of our future work across the national church. So I do believe we are entering a new era when the rhetoric of support for children's, youth and families ministers will begin to turn very much into real support. And I want to assure you that your voices are going to be a hugely important part of that. So I'm sorry I can't be with you, but looking forward to hearing your feedback, and I will certainly be praying for your gathering. Thank you.
We have started recording, so please do not swear. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to share screen again just to give us a quick overview of the report that we're kind of here to discuss. And I just want to make it really clear, these are my reflections of what stands out to me. When we go into breakout rooms and do discussion and questions, don't let my prompts of questions just lead your conversation. If you look at it and think, well, that's a load of nonsense from Ali, this is what I think we need to be focusing on, do that, please, really do that. These are just my observations. The things in black there are what I think stood out from the report, and then in green are my little comments. I'm just going to run through these in about 3 minutes, and then we're going to dive into breakout rooms. So firstly, collaboration has been poor between church, home and school. That's one of the things that is, I mean, my question after that is that a feature of the pandemic? So it's just got worse through the pandemic, or are we recognizing actually that was the norm pre-pandemic? We've just seen it come into sharper focus perhaps. And the nexus there is there for two reasons, because it illustrates connection, but also it's a reference to the Nexus, Faith in the Nexus report, which I'd also encourage you to look at if you haven't, which was done by Canterbury University, because I think that feeds into whatever conversations we have about how we navigate our way forward. Second one, parents not feeling equipped or lacking confidence. My question, particularly as we've thought about the pandemic, is that overwhelmed? Just there's so much going on. There was so much information and content being thrown at parents. Was it just that there's just too much happening rather than lacking confidence? That's just my reflection. And then is there or has there just generally been limited faith talk in the home? Was that a feature of pre-pandemic? And again, we've just seen, suddenly parents needing to be Sunday school teacher, pastor, all of the things, and just not feeling they're adequate for that role. I have a sort of separate question I've not put in there. We've had wonderful resources and tools like Parenting for Faith for the last 5 years. And beyond that, if you think back to when Rachel Turner first wrote the books, I guess an additional question I've got is, when we've got those resources and that's about equipping the home, why does it seem that the statistics and the referencing back from parents still says the same thing? We lack confidence, we're not quite sure what we're doing. It's not a reflection on BRF, it's more just asking the question, what is it we're not doing right about equipping the home, if that is still how parents feel? And then that thought of children being passive recipients of what is done to them or for them, that stood out to me in the report. But again, I'm kind of asking the question, are they though? Because if you read David Sinos's book, Little Theologians, he talks about the fact that actually children aren't passive receivers. They're making meaning from their environment and from what's happening in the context they find themselves. And so if they're doing that, they're creating theology, they're thinking about things and coming to their own conclusions. So I'm not quite sure that's accurate, but how do we pick up on that in terms of our practice? And then the final thought that stood out to me was something that was said in the report: church leaders, parachurch need to respond. And I just asked the question, what about denominations and training institutions? I guess I worry that sometimes we leave things to the local church to sort out things locally, or we expect the parachurch to bail out what I think sometimes the denominations aren't doing. For example, Parenting for Faith, fantastic resource, Care for the Family's Kitchen Table project, but they're parachurch / publishers delivering that content. I'm not seeing in the same way our denominations step up into that space. Now, maybe your reflection's different. As I say, these are my reflections and observations. That's it. That's all I'm saying. I might comment in group when I'm with other people, but I'm going to try very hard to just listen. So question 1, this is just my starter for 10, if you like. And I've put in brackets there, my reflective process. You know, what's going on, or what's my reading of that? So what? What does that mean? Now what? What do we do in response to that? And this is my first question, but if this doesn't float your boat in your group, think about your own reflections on the report. I'm hoping or assuming that we've all read it or looked at it at least, and are ready to kind of engage in conversation and discussion about it. So that's the first question I just want to see us tease around, talk about in our groups. So we're going to get going with that. I'm going to stop screen sharing if everybody's got a snapshot of that. Are we service provider rather than a partner in the nurturing of faith in children? If so, I should have put if so rather than just I'm saying that as a statement. If so, why is this? What needs to change? You might feel that's not what the church is doing. If your church isn't doing that and has got a fantastic relationship that is partnering with the home, then I think most of us would really want to hear about it, because for me, that's not generally my experience of what the church is like. So if that is your church, we all want to know. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing and pop us into groups. Hopefully. No, I'm on mute, obviously. Welcome back, everybody. What would be great is just to have a little bit of reflection back from the groups. If anybody is feeling confident about being a spokesperson for the group they were in, that would be awesome. Just so we together can have a little bit of time to reflect. I know there's quite a few of us. There's 38 of us in this space, but if we could just rattle around the rooms, that would help us see whether there's some common ground in terms of what we've discussed, or actually if we've diverged and we've already gone off in our own avenues of exploration, which is absolutely fine if we have, but it'd just be great to hear back from the groups about where your discussion went. So if you can remember which group you were in, already I'm beginning to think, I wonder what group I was in, but I think I was in group 6. But can we start at group 1? So if you're in a group 1 and you are happy to feedback from your group, that would be great. Anybody from group 1 who then feels that's inadequate can jump in on behalf of group 1 as well and just say, can I just add? And then we'll go to group 2. So if you're group 1, now's your chance.
Shall I make a start? I'm group 1.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm looking at Facebook. Okay. Yeah, we diverged quite early, if I'm honest, but we started off by talking about the fact that although we recognise that there is a need for shift and change, that actually a lot of churches were still just exhausted from getting through a pandemic, and it's a struggle to kind of not just slip back into something that we can do because it's manageable and we're all exhausted. And that a lot of the reasons why we were so effective in the pandemic at kind of connecting with families was because we didn't necessarily have to do all those regular weekly things that we would have done. So all the extra stuff like schools visits and toddler groups, when they were stopped, gave us the space to build relationship more. And it's a struggle now to maintain that relationship. And so we feel like exhaustion and just burnout is still a big problem in our churches, and it makes it difficult to have these kind of conversations. And then we shared a lot about just kind of our awareness of all the research that's been done about how keeping children and young people in the church is to do with relationship and genuinely making them part of a church family, and that we know all this stuff, but actually having that, maybe the challenge now is to have those conversations with leaders in the churches to try and bring culture shift. That there's not sort of a quick solution to this, but we've got to just really commit to long-term culture shift, and and making sure that all ages feel part of what church is. I think there's probably other stuff. Anyone else want to jump in? Go for it.
Yeah, group 1 people, anything to add? Fantastic. Jessica, you did a great job of summing up there. Nobody's leapt in. Group 2, somebody just share what you were reflecting on. That would be awesome.
Shall I go? We talked about how if we see ourselves as churches as service providers, then that's what we are. We offer activities and programs and events, and we invite people to them. And actually, we need to switch that around and look at our relationships and build genuine friendships with people. And then we get together and do stuff with our friends, and change that mindset. And alongside that, we talked about how as churches, we like things that are tidy and measurable, which might be why we like our activities and our clubs and our programs. And family life is messy and parenting is messy, and we just need to embrace some of that a bit more. I think they were our main points.
Great, thanks, Becky. Anything to add from group 2? Awesome. Group 3.
I think that was us. We were thinking about families and the different approaches. There were a few lovely stories of encouragement about enabling families to share faith with their own circle, their own family during pandemic. A Messy Church Goes Wild, a Muddy Church, making space really, and handing over the ideas and the equipment and the space to families to talk about faith. An interesting quote from someone saying that a parent said, it's not my place to speak about faith, and how can we turn that around? Thinking about sort of practical things like family faith, doing it in little bite-sized chunks. Lectio Divina for families, really, really good resource. Sense that this needs to be filtered up from people who are doing it at the grassroots level up to the church leaders at various levels. And this question of how do we help turn around the question of the problem that parents don't expect always to nurture faith. They might expect to come and belong to a community, but how do we help them to see themselves as being the primary developers of faith in their family? Something about that there never has been faith at home in certain church traditions in this country. So what we're doing is actually mega revolutionary. We're changing the course of history potentially. The busyness that other people have mentioned, groups 1 and 2 have mentioned, and the problem of families not coming as regularly to church as they did before. So the whole knock on with relationships and belonging and ownership. I think that covers most of it.
Great, thanks, Lucy. Anything to add, group 3? Awesome. You do realise if you've done a feedback, you're now the nominated person, because so far it's just been outstanding. So nobody's had anything to add. It's all been brilliant. So I think that's just you for the rest of the afternoon, I'm afraid. Okay, group 4, let's have your feedback. That'd be great.
I think we were group 4, but I'm sorry if we weren't. We've got some nods. Brilliant.
Oh, they're nodding.
Great. And please do add, I won't be the best at feedbacking. Some of the things we've already been said, like, yes, we tend to be service providers, and unfortunately that does mean that the relational stuff, it gets secondary, and that actually maybe just sitting around wondering over a story is really what we all need to do. Inadvertently, the experts can disempower parents and other people in the churches from actually sharing faith as well. And we talked about how, sadly, the understanding of children's spirituality, although all of us here in this place will understand that, actually in the churches that isn't often understood what children's spirituality is about, and also what childhood spirituality is about, that we all have that child within us, and that the culture of our churches, if it's about the experts, whether they're ministers or whatever, or children's workers, telling people what to believe, what the theology is, putting people in boxes, then we're disempowering, and we're sharing a different way of faith nurture from what could be really empowering for all of us. So if the culture is, we don't think, we don't wonder, we don't question, then we're going to pass that to the children. And so if parents aren't wondering and thinking and realizing it's a journey, then they won't understand how that is with the children as well. So it's something which is really deeply rooted, maybe, and that maybe stems from hierarchy and all sorts of other things in the history of the church. So it's, where is the power held, maybe, as well. And if we're all little theologians throughout all our lives, then that just changes everything. Yeah, is there anything else big things that I've missed out that other people haven't said from my group? Ali, you were muted then.
Sorry, I said great job, Catherine. Let's have group 5.
So I'm happy to speak for group 5. We were talking a lot about sort of the before and after of COVID, and how COVID has made it really hard. Lots of families seem to have lost their way. We haven't got the attendance of the families that we had before. And sadly, lots of churches have become more segregated since COVID, was the experience in our group, rather than less segregated. Some of us were feeling that although we were beginning to partner well with families before COVID, unfortunately, since that's kind of been taken away from us a little bit, and we feel more like a service provider now than we did before, which is a sad kind of turnaround of events. So yeah, a lot of thinking about the difficulties post pandemic, really, where we all feel we are. But we heard some great stories about things that had happened during the pandemic, some great WhatsApp groups sending out messages directly to families and children, and another church which was really joining up faith with children's learning and helping them with schoolwork through different people in the church setting up teaching sessions and so on. So there was little glimmers of hope and lovely stories, but I think the overwhelming thought was things are harder now, in terms of numbers and the support we're getting and the input that we're allowed to give, and church leaders, again, it was flagged up how important it is that we have that support. So a couple of churches have been without a minister or leader, and that's really hard to do things if you haven't got that support. But another church talking about how great it was to work with a minister and to be sort of supported in that way. So I think flagging up how important it is that our church leaders, ministers, whatever their term is in our denomination, really are on board and understand and stand with us and support us in what we're trying to do.
Great, thanks, Karis. And group 6, the group I was hanging out in, but not me, so it needs to be somebody else.
Okay, yeah. Hopefully I've written down pretty much it. There was a couple of us that started jobs during the pandemic, so we felt that we had a clean sheet, so to say. There was some really encouraging stories. And what came up quite a bit was, and as in other groups, was the building relationships is foundation. We also looked at, asked some questions. What is church? What does it look like before, now, in the future? And one of the questions we felt that is great is to ask the question, why are we doing this? Why are we doing, we don't have to go back to what we were doing, and look about, building those relationships and thinking about what the purpose of what we're doing is. But the main thing was the building relationships was foundation. Please feel free to jump in if I've missed bits and pieces.
I just raised a question about how do we work with unchurched families? So a lot of this report seems to me to be about families connected with the church. What about those families that we work with the children, but not necessarily the parents? So what does that look like in terms of service providing or non-service providing, for people who only engage on the drop-off and pick-up?
Great, thanks both. So I've got another question so that we can go back and just have some further reflection together. And again, if as you're talking other things crop up, then bring those into your conversation. That would be great. So that was question one. Question two for me was this. Are we focused too much on creating content, resources, tools, books, training material, over encouraging connection? Have we kind of already touched on this, I think. Have we created a dependency culture? What do we do about it? I think for me, at the beginning of the pandemic, I mean, I am a resource provider in one sense. I try and flag up for people where they can get resources, and I like to be in the know about where a resource is. If I don't create something myself, I know where you can get it. And I get frustrated with myself if I can't point people to a resource, however obscure it seems their request might be. Oh, I know where that is. I can point you to a resource that does that. But I felt overwhelmed in March, April, because I felt suddenly so many organizations were trying to provide content and resources and support, that as a provider and somebody who's working alongside churches and young people, I felt I don't know where to begin. And I just wonder how others have felt through the pandemic. That was my experience as a practitioner and a resource provider. So it'd be great just to think about that. What's the difference between us creating content and then that encouraging connection? What does it look like to, going back to that, what we've already talked about, really build relationships? How do we do that better? What could that look like if we think that's the direction of travel that we need to go in? Do disagree, because I feel like I'm kind of suggesting things and you might go, no, that's not right. We need to do this instead. So let's jump back into our breakout rooms and just reflect on that. Content over connection, is that what we've been doing? But actually in the pandemic, for some of us, the connection stood to the fore. How do we recover that or retain that? So I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to dive back into groups and use that as a starter. If it goes elsewhere, that's brilliant. Talking to the same people. Fantastic. It would be great to have feedback if you've not forgotten what room you're in, because you were in a different ones the first time. So if you know what your room was at the top of your screen and you were group 1, then it would be great to have a bit of input from you.
Do any of us know what rooms we were in?
I don't know. Oh, Lisa's nodding at the top of my screen. Lisa was in 6. Okay. That was the same as before, so that's slightly easier, isn't it? I'll tell you what, let's just try and have a little bit of engagement with everybody. And if you've got some reflections from that conversation, let's just do it that way. Just feed in what your thoughts were and we'll see how we do.
Shall I jump in first again?
Go on, get in there. Go on.
I came in with a bit of bias about resourcing because I did a lot of resourcing in the pandemic, but we talked about how actually lots of the resources that we had they helped us to build the connection and relationship that we needed. That actually having things you could go and drop off on a doorstep, or having things like Muddy Church, we could go and, there was also to go and meet people and do trails and things like that. Actually, it was the resources that helped us to make those relationship connections. And that actually now we've almost not using any resources because we're trying to do it all without, but actually we mustn't let go of the fact that we were able to resource families, and sometimes that's a useful thing to continue to resource in this coming season. So we said
Great.
the best of both worlds. That's what we wanted.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Other thoughts? Doesn't have to be from that group or another group, just what your thoughts were from your conversation. Go on, Catherine.
We had a similar thing about resources can be helpful to build relationships, and relationships important. We talked a bit about just doing normal things with people, just hanging out, sort of thing. Jesus went for walks and ate fish and bread, tuna salad, whatever. Just be normal, and the wandering intentional as well, but not disingenuous. But actually, if we're just open and with our lives, then we, those sort of faith sharing, and not just our faith sharing, but hearing from others will just naturally come. And this was a personal thing for me, is I'm just wondering whether we've just really got it all wrong in the church anyway, because we're so concerned with our focus is bringing in new Christians or discipling Christians or bringing people into the church, that we just don't get out and just see what God's doing in the kingdom of God. And it tends to be, success is our children are coming to our church. Whereas actually, if we're hanging out at the weekend with children and helping them to learn more about themselves and themselves as loved people of God, whether or not they come to church in the end really doesn't matter. So the church tends to be about putting on activities, because then we can say, oh, so many people have come to this, or they're now going to come to our church. Maybe we just got it all wrong. And yeah.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, we said some similar things. It's about just doing life together. Church isn't just the building, and ministry needs to be more relational. And it's about context as well of where we are. Our theme for this year is going to be nurture to renew. So coming alongside each other and feeling the renewal in our relationships. And we also looked at, it's not just about having separate groups. It's like, right, we used to have the 0 to 5 group, we used to have this. It's about actually, it's each individual person's spiritual development and where they are on their spiritual journey with God. You could have, I said that you could have an 11-year-old that's further along in their spiritual development than a 62-year-old, or the other way round. So it's about looking at a whole church family together moving forward.
Thanks, Lisa.
I think in some contexts, I was in a city centre eclectic church. In some contexts, the pandemic actually revealed the lack of connection right across the church, and the lack of network within the church. In reality, people lived, sort of up to 5 or more miles away from each other across the city or beyond the city. And certainly it really highlighted the lack of connection between families within the church. It really emphasized, actually, the words us as a provider, although I hadn't thought about that as a word for that the families came into church for an X or a Y or a Z and then went back. And their networking, their support groups, their school, their activities, such as they might still have existed or not, were all outside church. And that was really, really revealing, that as an eclectic city centre church, it doesn't work easily as a networking church.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Just on how we understand church, I had an interesting conversation, just leaping in, with Terry Williams in Australia. Was it last year or the year before? And he said when he's been particularly in churches that are in the Middle East or in Africa, and they've had conversations about church, we in the West generally say we're about 300 strong or 150 of us. We talk in individual numbers when we talk about the church. But when he was talking in these contexts and asking people about their church, they would say, oh, we're about 15 households or about 20 households. And even just that, there's a different mindset in other parts of the world to what it means to be church and how the church is represented in community. So it's not represented in community just by the gathered church, it's represented in those communities by the households that are part of that family of God. And I just think that's an interesting thing. We never talk about that. At least I don't hear that, how we describe church in the UK. That for me is just an interesting observation that I'm sitting with from Terry around how we're connected or not and where our roots are in terms of family and understanding who we are together. Other thoughts or observations?
One of the things that we talked about in group, I think I was in group 1, was the focus on Sunday morning worship, and that after the pandemic, that's been the first thing for, I know, especially certainly in my case, that was the first thing that was the priority to get back to. And so however that looks for you on a Sunday morning, that seems to be the priority. And we were talking about how hard it is, that Sunday worship time is the hardest place to change if we're trying to bring any change. And so yeah, we just had a little bit of a discussion around that, and how some of us were talking about what, and it goes back into what the church is. Is church just the gathered church on a Sunday morning, or is church what's happening in a toddler group in the midweek, or the conversations you're having, a pastoral visit with a family, for example, on a Saturday afternoon or something like that. Whereas I think there's still, and this was happening pre-pandemic though, there still seems to be this focus on us. If you're not coming on a Sunday morning, are you really connected to the church? But we were also saying that actually discipleship is the hardest thing to do on a Sunday morning. That's not really where the real discipleship is happening. So anybody can disagree with me, but that's some of the stuff that we were talking about.
Thanks, Amanda.
Sorry to jump in again, but in response to what Amanda said, just want to flag up something at the church I used to belong to. Lucy Bolst, who's a pioneer minister now in Poole, she was in Sheffield for a number of years. She's on once a month, we had intergenerational, in which she just facilitated without anything that she brought to that Sunday morning. So beforehand, each household knew what passage of Bible, the passage in the Bible we'd read. And then she'd just say, okay, so after we'd had coffee and croissants or whatever together, we'd go into the room at the church and she'd say, okay, anything to help welcome us welcome. And a child might say, I want to give everybody a hug, or somebody might say, let's sing this song. Okay, now onto the worship, and people would just suggest, somebody might bring something or a CD or lead us in something or dance. And then the word, who'd like to read the word out? So somebody would read the word, and then children might give their opinions on the word, and adults might say, and people would stand up, and there would be disagreement, but we're fine to disagree. And then we'd have witness. So what is this? How do we go out now with this? How does this change our lives? And it was a brave thing to do, because we have a sizable church, maybe 70 people come together. There was nothing there prepared, because it's the liturgy of the people. It's and if our culture of church is we do this together, when we bring our households together and bring what we can, that changes everything about how we do children's ministry too.
Mm.
She did it brilliantly, and sadly she left down in Poole, but she's doing similar things down in Poole now with her work.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine.
We in our group, group 6, we talked a little bit about the way that actually, as not all adults are confident about talking about their faith, full stop. So that as parents, we're not always comfortable talking about our faith. So it's a bit about resourcing all of that conversation. We want parents to be able to talk about their faith, and need to be able to talk about their faith as people who happen to be parents as well as maybe.
Mm.
And so what Catherine was just talking about there, how do we do that with, there's a lot of stuff we need to encourage people to have more confidence to get things wrong as well as right within all that conversation, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Tiz. Okay, I've got one more question for us to, maybe as a starter, for us to reflect on. I'm praying that as we go into groups, it's not a nightmare again, but we'll see what happens. But let me just dance over here to share screen with you one more time. And I don't know if you've seen this meme around a lot. It's sometimes popped up on Twitter or Facebook. This is fine, everything's fine, while the building around us burns. So I guess my question is, what would be your top 3 things to focus on that would bring about positive change? And we might be thinking, you know, what we've got to get back to because we're not doing it and it was working well pre-pandemic. It might be things we've initiated or started that are thriving and somehow we want to retain those. It might be a bit like the building's burnt down and we're starting from scratch post-pandemic. We're not quite sure what needs to happen, but what would be your top 3? And for me, I'd love it if somehow we could all feed those in our groups and then try and reflect that back, because if there's some synergy around what together we think rises to the top, I think that would be really interesting. If we all come up with a different 3 things, that also is exciting for different reasons. It means we're creatively thinking ourselves and not just going along with what other people think, which is brilliant. But let's dive back into groups. I'm praying that this works. And just think on that. What top 3 things would you focus on that would bring about positive change? So imagine you could do it. Money's not an issue. Whether the church leader thinks it's a good idea is not an issue. What would you do if you could? I guess is what I'm asking. So here we go. Breakout rooms. Welcome back, everybody. Yet again, that was a little bit of chaos trying to put you into groups. I do apologise. Second most stressful thing that's ever happened to me, because the first one was worse. And then second, I've done this. I'll be all right. I've done this before, literally 15 minutes ago, so I'll be okay. Fantastic. What would be great, because I've got one final thing, and this is just for us to, you know, see where we are, we're not going to land anywhere, because I think there's conversations that have started that we're going to want to just carry on and keep reflecting on some of what we've shared today. But I guess really just almost like a finishing slide, if you like. What next? And it's partly thinking, you know, do people want to continue this conversation? What are we going to share and who are we going to share it with? What does that look like? What are the things that for you have most resonated from our conversation that you want to go away and think about in terms of your own context, but also have wider implications for the church? I'd be really interested to hear that. Bishop of Leicester at the beginning was keen to hear what we've talked about. We've recorded what we can, so I'll make that available, and you know, the slides that I've used just to give them a little sense of vague direction for us, although if you've talked about completely different things in your group, that's absolutely fine. So we've got about 10 minutes or so. I'm conscious that some people need to go and have taken a lot of their chunk of their time this afternoon to kind of hang out with us, which is fantastic. But if I stop sharing there, if we've got final things we'd like to reflect on and just say, you've had a burning thing you've wanted to mention the entire time we've talked together, or having had nearly 2 hours, there's something we've missed that we've just not mentioned, that you've been waiting for it to come up and it hasn't. So this is your chance to throw it into the mix.
Can I ask, in a purely selfish capacity, as I start off with this new job, I'm lucky in that I do have a place at the table, and I'm very keen to use that effectively. This is in the Church of England, so apologies to those of you who aren't. Is there something that you would like me to bring to the kind of national level of church around family ministries? Is there something that would really support you at that level, that would enable you to do the important stuff at local level or sort of diocesan level? It's kind of working out where to prioritize my time, really, and efforts. So if you've got any insights about that, please do stick it in the chat or let me know. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
This hand's going up. Alison, do you want to jump in there?
Hi. Two things. I think that intergenerational worship is incredibly important, but I'm hearing over and over and over again that our ministers are not trained, not confident, don't understand the importance of it, the benefits of it. So it's something that we're all being trained in, but the people who are leading, the clergy who are effectively leading our churches, are not in the same way. And I think that that's a big miss. And secondly, an understanding that time spent on relationships is at least as important as time spent on activity. So if our hours are being counted, like, you know, someone's looking at what are you doing, then actually the times when we're sat with someone who's broken because they haven't slept all night with their new baby is just as important as running the actual toddler group.
Thank you.
Caroline.
Yeah, Lucy, training of clergy at initial training and curacy training. In that, I think many of us, I don't know, there's quite a lot of wide range here. I don't know whether it happens in other denominations and church groups, but we hit the glass ceiling with your minister very, very often, and you bang your head more times than you can count. And certainly for me, in 25 years, you know, I have banged my head so many times, because you cannot get beyond that if their mindset and training does not take them to where you are wanting to go. So training in initial training, not just the two sessions or 2 days or whatever, and you've done children's and youth ministry, is really, really crucial. And also bishops. We had a bishop, and that actually institutional change needs to be from the top down and the bottom up.
Yeah, thanks. Mary and then Claire.
I think that what has come out as well is that children are not the ones that we have got to teach everything to. I remember my first godly play training where we had a jar that was full, and that was the child. And I think the child can offer everyone, especially adults, more. And I think that's got to be acknowledged as well.
Thanks, Mary. Claire.
Thank you. I'm seeing lots and lots of comments about training for clergy. And would like to stress that I think that it's got to be more than just an afternoon from an expert like yourself. One of the things that I've seen done once, because I was involved in it in the Episcopal Church, was, you know, like people in ministry will have a placement church where they go and they have different placement churches in their course. One ordinand up here had a special interest in children's ministry. So she had a placement in youth and children's ministry, and I was her supervisor as the youth and children officer. And it was the only time they'd had a non-clergy person as a supervisor. And it meant it wasn't location specific, it was subject specific, and it was up to me to find her different contexts with excellent youth and children's work of all varieties that she could experience. And that seemed to me to be a really good way to go for training, to embed it in their training like that and make it part of their placement programme, not just a workshop.
I know these in response to, thank you. I know these in response to what Lucy said, but are they also sitting there amongst people's top 3? I'm looking for nods of heads. If there's other things that would be in your top 3,
yes,
now would be the time to lob them in.
I was speaking in our group, and not, obviously in our top 3 was the support from clergy and leaders, but it was also support from the congregation as a whole, and the kind of maybe some views of kind of, well, you know, when I was in Sunday school 40 years ago, we went off and no one saw us and no one heard us, and COVID has kind of brought us a bit back to that. A lot of Sunday schools have had to meet in separate buildings and haven't been back in church as much as they wanted to, and when they have been, there's been social distancing, so we have kind of gone back a little bit to that segregation. So it's about bringing the integration back into church, not just with the leaders but with the congregation as a whole.
Great, thanks, Alex. There's some great comments going in the chat. Do have a look at that before I'll shut the Zoom. We've got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Any burning things people want to say?
Yeah.
Karen, go on.
I think there was another different streak in this conversation, which was who we are. Whether we're called children's workers, children's ministers, enablers, actually affects how we are viewed, and B, how that relationship within the congregation develops very often. There was also comment on the fact that a lot of the people who are working with children, and particularly, are self-identifying as women. There are people, and the pay problem within children's ministry, the fact that actually you can't bring up a family on it, you can't be the chief worker, chief pay person within that, because it's physically not possible. So there are a whole load of other issues which need positive change that came up from our group as to who we are in it.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. Okay, a couple of things just to finish. We could, I'm sure, if we had the time, just carry on into the evening and keep talking about these things. For everybody who's come along to the Zoom and those who said they wanted to but haven't been able to make it, I'm going to do a follow-up where hopefully whatever we've recorded, and now I'm anxious about what we have managed to record, given what happened to the breakout rooms, but we have recorded stuff, so that will be then shared and made available to others. I'll try and do, from the recording, draw out a few of the key things that I think we've said. I think for me, one of the things that's important is about what we feel we have as those passionate about this area of ministry in terms of support. It was mentioned a little bit from some in the chat, just that sense of it's a lonely business sometimes being involved in children's, youth and family ministry, and where is our support and our encouragement. Bishop of Leicester mentioned paraclesis at the beginning. I wasn't going to do a big thing about it. I'll just say, if you're interested in what that is, if you've never heard of what it is, do drop me an email. If you're interested in being part of something, the plan is it's going to be an association for children's, youth and family ministers to support and encourage one another. And if you want to know more about what that's going to look like, what we hope it's going to look like, just drop me an email. That's all I'm going to say on that. In terms of going forward, it would be great to meet again if people are up for that and continue the conversation. I'm going to feed stuff back to the Bishop of Leicester and also hopefully Archbishop of York and his office, just in terms of Church of England and some of the stuff that we've talked about, that they'll hear that. And also there was somebody from a training institution who had to go, but they've heard and reflected with this. I'm doing some training with them in the Northwest. My desire, my personal hope is in terms of clergy training and those training for leadership in the church, that increasingly much of their formation looks at faith formation of children, young people and families, and what that looks like. Children's spirituality, which we've mentioned, that many clergy I know have never had any training on at all. So that's what I'm hoping is going to come from our conversation. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon, and it's been great to hang out, and I hope it's not been too chaotic with me hosting you. So thanks so much for coming, and look forward to seeing some of you again and continuing the conversation. It is now 4 o'clock, so we're going to finish on time.